Well, the holiday season is once again upon us, and you know what that means. That's right. That means it's time to start making gifts in our shop because we're too cheap to buy people real presents. Woodworking just isn't much fun if there isn't someone on the receiving end who will appreciate and adore your workmanship. And the holidays are an awesome time because they give us an excuse to go above and beyond by giving someone a handcrafted, one-of-a-kind gift. Now, most people will appreciate the fact that you toiled for hours in your workshop turning a lifeless board of wood into a functional and beautiful work of art. Now today, we'll be taking these lifeless boards and turning them into cool pencil holders like this. They can also be used to hold pens. So here we are at the wood pile. Basically, all of my big stuff is in the shop on the rack, and all of the smaller and a lot of the exotic pieces that kind of stay around for a long time, they stay out here on the patio. So I've got some really cool stuff here. We've got a lot of Wengi, I've got cherry, here's some Hotoba, some yellow heart, here's some zebra wood, and what is this? That's more Hotoba. This is going to be really nice. I've got some lace wood. That's going to be fantastic. So a lot of little tiny pieces that I probably would have no other use for. They're going to find a home in some of these pencil holders. So that's what I recommend doing. Check out the wood pile and make use of some of that little scrap. Now here's just some of the woods that I've selected to make a bunch of these pencil holders. Take a look at what we've got here. We've got some figured maple. This stuff is going to be gorgeous. Hotoba. Purple heart. This I can't even remember exactly what it is. It looks like some kind of a rosewood, not 100% sure. Walnut. We've got lacewood. Padauk, that's going to turn really dark red over time. This piece was actually shaded for the last few months, so that's why it's so bright. We've got yellow heart, and we've got Wengi. So now the thing to keep in mind with these colors, to me it looks better to have a darker color at the base and a lighter color on the sides. It seems to be weighted better if the heavier color is toward the bottom. But you know, the bottom line is lots of different color combinations you could do here. Have fun with it, and just remember, one man's gaudy is another man's gorgeous. Now for today's project, we're going to use the figured maple for the sides and this Hotoba for the base.
This pencil holder has three main parts: the base, the glue block, and the four-sided mitered top. The base itself will be cut from 4/4 Hotoba to 4.5 inches square. I should be able to get 3 bases out of this piece. Yellow chalk gives me a highly visible rough cut line. This piece of maple should give me enough material for 2 pencil holders. Each side piece should be 4 3/4 inches long by 3 1/4 inches wide. And since they only need to be 1/4 inch thick, I can slice this board in half on the bandsaw and get my second set of 4 sides. In order to make the piece more manageable, I rip the maple board into 2 halves. Next, I head over to the bandsaw. I use a combination square to draw a center line down the board. I then use that center line as a guide while I slice the board into 2 pieces. This is a great way to get the most out of your expensive hardwoods. Next, I joint one face and one edge of each board. And I repeat the process for the base piece. Because the maple is highly figured, I prefer to use my drum sander to bring the pieces down to final thickness, 1/4 inch. The Hotoba base, however, goes through the planer and is milled to 3/4 inch thick. Now if you don't have these tools, you can always use hand planes, scrapers, and sanders to bring your wood to the desired thickness, or simply buy pre-milled lumber. Next, I rip all of our boards to width, 3 1/4 inches for the top pieces, and 4.5 inches for the base.
Now with all of our pieces cut to width, it's time to cut them to length. Now before you do that though, just like the jointing and planing operations that are easier when these pieces are in this longer form, it's probably not a bad idea to go ahead and sand these at this time too, rather than dealing with the tinier small pieces. This way you can run a random orbit sander across here really easily. I was actually just about to cut the bottom pieces, and I realized my Hotoba board, you can see that, has a little crack in it. And sometimes these things don't show themselves until you start milling through the pieces and exposing what flaws might lay underneath. So there's a couple ways I'm going to deal with it. I'm not throwing the board away. You know, it's meant to consume scrap, so I want to make sure I do that. So I typically do one of two things. I either use CA glue, if it's a really tiny hairline crack. Okay, this dries, it's very brittle. I don't really like it for filling large cracks. It's a little bit too brittle and it tends to not look very natural. Option number two is epoxy. And I've got some 5-minute epoxy here, and I actually prefer the longer cure epoxies, but in this case I'm in a little bit of a rush and I want this to dry so that I can start working with the piece again. So just a dab will do you. A little bit in there. And since the crack is near the edge, I'm going to apply some tape just in case I'm messy. I don't want it to go over my freshly sanded face. Just a security measure here. And then I'm going to carefully start applying the epoxy and actually pushing it with this little piece of scrap wood. Pushing it into that crack. Let it seep down. Now you can add color to the epoxy if you feel the need. In this case, the clear epoxy is going to make it look like a black streak. And this Hotoba actually has a few of these black streaks, so that works out in our favor this time. So after about 15 minutes, you can see the epoxy's hardened up, at least enough for us to work with it. You could scrape it off, you could use a chisel or a hand plane. For me, my table saw is set at the same setting it was when I cut this initially, so I'm just going to run it through for another pass and clean it up that way. Now you can see we've cleaned it up, and what was an eyesore and a crack and could potentially have been unstable over time now just looks like it's part of the grain.
All of our pieces are cut to the appropriate length using the following technique on the miter saw. I start by trimming one side square. I then measure and mark the appropriate length, in this case 4.5 inches. Now since I plan on cutting multiples here, I set up a stop block. I flip the workpiece around so that the square end is against the stop. Using the pencil line for reference, I lined everything up perfectly and secure the stop with a clamp. Now keep in mind that this would be a pretty dangerous cut without the use of a hold down. It's never a good idea to have a loose piece of material wedged between a stop and the blade.
Now for the sides, we have to cut a nice 45-degree miter on every edge of the piece. Okay, so we get a nice joint all the way around. To do that, I'm going to do it on the table saw. You'll notice here I've got a 0 clearance insert for just the standard blade and my splitter. Now in order to do this, if we start tilting that blade left or right, it's not going to fit in my 0 clearance insert. So I have to go back to the original stock insert that came with the saw. So before I tilt the blade to 45, I like to raise it up nice and high and then start to tilt. So the reason I had you put the blade all the way up is because I want to get some sort of a gauge under there, some kind of a right angle, like a speed square. You have these little guide blocks like that. These, I don't even know where I got that from, but it's dead on 45 degrees. You could even use this part of your adjustable square to make sure that it's at a 45-degree angle. The gauge, it gets it close on your saw, but I usually don't trust it. I have to double check it with something else. So I'm going to use this little guy and use this to dial it in dead on 45 degrees. Now just a quick safety note. Running these little pieces over a 45-degree blade that close to the blade is very, very dangerous. So you have to make sure you take the right precautions. Obviously, you're not going to use your bare hands for this. If you've got one of these, you can use that. If you got even one of these fancy deals, you could use that. For me personally, the best thing is my little foam padded grip that I use for my jointer all the time. You can use them on the router table. This is going to give me the most surface area coverage and the most control over this piece. My fingers are going to come a little closer to the blade than I normally would like them to be, but I feel pretty secure because I'm holding this piece of plastic and there's really no chance of me slipping off and hitting the blade. So that's what I'm going to use, but you got to make sure you think about this before you make that cut. What is the safest way to do it?
Simply line up your cut by eye, and then cut the bevel.
Now, I don't know if you guys can see this, but I was a little bit short. Okay, so I have this little tiny strip here, about 1/16 of an inch. So I need to move the fence over a little bit more and cut again, but you absolutely want to dial that in so that we don't remove any more material than necessary to get our 45-degree angle cuts. Now that our pieces are cut, you take a look at these and you start to realize, wow, we've got these little baby miters to deal with. You know, it doesn't really need reinforcement because it's not a really heavy-duty use item, so it just needs a really good strong glue bond. So I've got a few tricks up my sleeve for how we're going to handle that. Check it out.
Lay the side pieces on the table with the insides facing down. Grab your trusty roll of clear packing tape and place little strips across each joint. Take extra care to make sure that everything is aligned properly and the joint is tight. Once all 4 pieces are connected, I place a long strip of tape over all 4 pieces with about 2 to 3 inches of overhang to the left. Press the tape securely over the joints. Then I place a second strip with a 2 to 3 inch overhang to the right. Now flip the pieces over and brush some glue onto the miters. Now comes the fun part. Lift both sides up and bring the 2 ends together. The 4 pieces will automatically line up and the tape will act as a clamp. Use the overhanging tape to lock everything in place, and you're done. It's that easy.
Now you're bound to get a little bit of squeeze out on the inside of your joints here, so give it about 20 minutes to dry and then just take an old chisel or some sort of a scraper and run it along that inside edge, and that material will peel right out. And you might want to get a little piece of sandpaper afterwards if you can get your fingers in there and clean it up a little bit more, but that'd be more than adequate for a project like this.
And now we need to round the decorative profile on our base. I like to use a 1/2 inch round over bit for this. And I set the bit height so that it creates a small 1/8 inch lip. This minor detail makes a big difference in the final product. 2 things to note here. Number 1, start by routing the end grain first. And this makes sure that any tear out is cleaned up by the subsequent cuts. Number 2, I'm only removing a little material at a time. Hotoba is a very dense wood and can chip out easily. Making small cuts and moving the fence closer each time stacks the cards in our favor for a nice crisp edge.
Okay. Now, it's inevitable in certain woods, when you make this type of cut, you are going to have some problems with chip out, no matter how many passes you take. I believe I did this one in about 5 passes on each side, and I still got a little bit of chip out right there. Okay, so it's not a major problem. Some people might just be okay leaving it alone. I'd like to actually fix that. So let me show you how I would do it.
I start by using a sharp chisel to clean up the chip out. Believe it or not, the first step in fixing this is to do more damage. You see, we need a nice, flat, smooth area to glue our repair to. Now, the only time that I wouldn't do this is if we actually were able to recover the chipped out piece. And just a quick safety note, clamp your workpiece down when you do this. It's much easier and much safer. Next, I cut a small sliver of Hotoba from a piece of scrap. This is going to serve as our patch. I then sand one side of the patch to make sure it's flat and smooth. I place some CA glue on the base and some accelerator on the patch. Now when I bring these together, I'll have about 2 seconds before the glue starts to cure. Don't glue your fingers to the board. After a minute or two, I begin paring away the excess material on the top of the patch. Then I lightly sand the top flush. Next, I remove excess material from the side of the patch. Be very careful here. One slip and you'll have a nice gouge in your roundover. Just a little more sanding. And then finally, I saw off the little overhanging piece.
No matter how hard you try, you will probably end up with burning when you do your routing. And it's on the end grain, which is never any fun to sand. So grab some sandpaper and grab whatever little implements you have around to get into that little tiny corner and start sanding. Now with both of our main components complete, we have to start thinking about how we're going to attach this to this. All right, you can't really just glue it like this because we've got end grain here, and we know that end grain doesn't really glue very well to anything. So we need to have some extra reinforcement. And what I like to do is cut a little block out of 1/2-inch birch plywood that fits perfectly on the inside of our little pencil box here. And mine is about 2 5/8 by 2 5/8. All right, so I've already got that cut ready to go. So what I like to do is actually glue this to the surface ahead of time, and then drop this on top with glue all around that surface and make sure we get a nice, good glue bond. And for a pencil holder, that's good enough. Now before the final glue up, you want to make sure you sand all of your edges nice and smooth. You want to make sure that there's no really sharp areas where you might cut yourself, especially on the inside lip where people's hands are going to be going. You also want to make sure that this guy sits nice and level and doesn't have a wobble to it. Just in case one of these pieces wasn't cut perfectly, you want to make sure that it sits nice and flat, and that way the glue bond is going to be really good. All right, so if it's not, the easiest thing to do, get yourself a full sheet of, I'd say about 100 or 120 grit sandpaper, lay that down on a flat surface, something that you know is flat, and then put this down right on the surface and push down and twist. Think of opening a can of tomato sauce. And after a few twists, you should be left with something that is relatively flat and will increase the strength of our glue bond.
To glue up our pencil holder, I spread the glue on both the glue block and the base. Now the glue block is going to slide around quite a bit, and once you have it centered, which you can usually do by eye, clamp it into position. Or if you have them, shoot 2 brad nails through the block and into the base. After an hour or two, I spread epoxy all around the glue block. Then I slide the top on and clamp it down.
Now these pencil holders will look great on anybody's desk, and for that matter, in anybody's workshop. Now when you do decide to make them, let me give you a bit of advice. Make a bunch of them. It takes almost as long to make 5 of these as it would to make 1 of them. Once everything is set up, you just batch them through. And trust me, you're going to thank me when you start getting all the questions, hey, that's cool, can you build me one? So it's nice to have a few of them in stock at home so you could just quickly hand them out when you need to. So if you have any questions or comments, you can email me at mark@thewoodwhisperer.com. Now, all this woodworking has got me pretty thirsty. In fact, I'm parched. Where's my serving wench? Serving wench? Oh, there she is.
So I thought you were supposed to dress up.
I am dressed up. I'm Mario or Luigi.
Sure.
I'm a guy with a mustache.
All right. Well, anyway.
Happy Halloween.
Happy Halloween.
For one man's gaudy is another man's gorgeous. Does that look good? Let's at thewoodwhisperer.com. Forgot my line. Let's go. Must be Halloween because you're wearing your bitch outfit. Oh! You look sexy.
You like it?